Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started. Welcome to this session. My name is Clémentine Griot. I work with the Convention on Migratory Spaces, where my work focuses on international environmental governance and cooperation around environmental. It's really a pleasure to moderate this session among colleagues who are working at the forefront of climate, environment, energy, and practice and research. The title of this session, as I hope you know, is Cross-Pollinating, Peacebuilding, and Climate Practice. The term cross-pollinating is actually quite important, and I hope that's the reason you're here. In many ways, that is the challenge we're exploring today. Whether we are talking about climate adaptation, natural resource governance, energy, practitioners increasingly find themselves working on the same underlying issues, often in the same places and with the same communities. Yet they do not always approach those issues through the same frameworks, institutions, approaches, and methods. So today's discussions will bring an opportunity to explore what happens when we bring all of those perspectives together. How can climate and environmental initiatives become more conflict sensitive? How can it can integrate energy approaches, gender approaches, borderlands approaches. So yes, our panel will bring perspective from advocacy, research, innovative programming to help us explore those questions. We'll have time in the end for questions and engagement with the public. Before we begin, we'd like to establish a few principles for our discussion. We want this room to be a respectful and intellectual space for open dialogue. With that in mind, let us begin. I'll start by introducing Tasnia Prova, who will be our first speaker. Tasnia is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, a development practitioner and a researcher. Prior to her doctoral studies, Tasnia served as a climate research lead at the Center for Peace and Justice at Brock University, where she led research examining the intersections of climate change, security, and peace in the climate's vulnerable borderlands, southwestern Bangladesh. Using community-based and participatory research methodologies, her work investigates how climate stressors interact with governance system, political violence, and local experiences within security. And now her doctoral research continues this line of inquiry, exploring how complex and often contradictory planning systems shape vulnerability, violence, and peace in climate-affected contexts. Welcome, Tasnia. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for that massive introduction. Hi, everyone. I am Tasnia Kondakar. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Tasnia Kondakar Prova. Like Clementine said, I am a PhD planning student at the University of Toronto. My presentation today is based on a 2-year research project that I was involved in between the years of 2022 and 2024, funded by the UK government. The findings that I share with you today laid the foundation for my doctoral project. The story doesn't start on this day, but it sure did change it. On August 5th, 2024, a student-led citizen uprising organized what was called a march to Dhaka. Dhaka is the capital city of Bangladesh. This event was a month in the making after protests over equal job access was met with police brutality in Bangladesh, killing thousands, and transforming it into a confrontation with against decades of authoritarian rule. On this day, realizing that the people are not going to back down, the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh fled the country to India. I took this picture right after news broke out that she had left, and people had flooded the streets, happy and hopeful for a better future. But after she left, a series of confrontations ensued. Immediately after, security forces had retracted. People were left to protect themselves from looters and violent mobs. The interim government, led by Muhammad Yunus, was sworn in on August 8th. However, that did very little to stop the proliferation of violence. Members of Hasina's party, the Awami League, were hunted down, beaten up, even killed. Many of them are in jails today. Minorities, too, who have historically supported the Awami League party, were attacked. There were contested claims over whether these attacks were communal and had religious underpinnings, or if they were political. Countrywide protests started. People wanted their politically aligned bosses fired. They wanted better salaries, better roads. And it's as if they found themselves with placards asking the interim government to fix quickly what broke in 15 years. India and Bangladesh were catapulted into an unparalleled state of tensions. Borders were closed, fearing that the unrest would lead to an outpouring of Bangladeshis into India. Perceptions about India being hostile to Muslims and Bangladesh being hostile to Hindus further divided communities. But this wasn't new. Even during a time of apparently better bilateral ties, the borders between Bangladesh and India were still insecure. In the last 15 years, over 600 people have been killed along the Bangladesh-India borders. Over 800 people have been injured, with many others kidnapped. After August 2024, a new border dynamic was reported. Over 2,000 people who were residents of India, but without the right paperwork, were pushed into Bangladesh and regarded as Bangladeshi infiltrators. For an agrarian Bangladesh, India's hydropower policies have long been a point of contention. India has over 40 structures on 54 transboundary rivers, with undisputed control over water flow. Pockets along this 4,096-kilometer long land border, fifth largest in the world, is also differently fragile. Border conflict scholars predominantly look at the north for research because the north border has had enclaves, the Shiliguri corridor, which is a thin corridor, a chicken neck corridor contested by different states, and fragility patterns in India's northeast next to Bangladesh is also very fragile. However, when you look at the south, you're expected to sort of analyze it from a diplomatic perspective. It's considered a diplomatic hub, where India has invested billions of dollars in border infrastructure, and 30% of all bilateral trade between the two countries happen in the south. However, the context that is often ignored in the south is that violence may be less visible, but is not absent. Rather, in 2024, the highest deaths by physical torture and the second highest numbers of injuries of Bangladeshi citizens were recorded along the southern pocket of the Bangladesh-India borders. Post-August unrest, the daily transport of 1,000 trucks across borders were stalled, businesses were stalled, and traders were forced to spend more on other forms of transport. The Southwest also sits on a low-lying delta, affected by climate disasters like cyclones and floods every year. By 2050, climate predictions warn that a significant portion of this delta will go underwater, displacing millions. Its porous features and the risk of mass climate migration has made this border into what Jason Cons has called a global climate borderland. To contain climate suffering within nation-state borders is a concern for the state itself, but also states everywhere. The project that we did set out to understand how fragility is shaped at the intersections of climate security and climate change and border security. We covered different locations. Two of the sites were adjacent to river borders to understand how eroding banks coupled with porosity affected lives. Two were adjacent to the Sundarbans forest, the largest mangrove forest in the world, divided and shared between Bangladesh and India, where climate change and unsynchronized conservation policies drive tensions. And the last site was further along the land report that I discussed to understand how and if border infrastructures impact local economies and governance. Selected sites were able to capture competing planning interests. Primarily by that of the military in terms of securitization, conservation actors, and international climate planners who are trying to use a global sort of blueprint of climate adaptation on local land, and also broadly local governance planning, which has historically been influenced by a culture of corruption and rent seeking. We were able to visit each site thrice. The last one was after August 2024, so after the Prime Minister had fled. This was the only time in my life I took a taser to field work because, like I said, law and order were just not functioning the way it did before. Our findings were broadly divided into 4 themes. The first was on mobility or immobility. While we found that cross-border migration was a reality, the majority of people moved inwards towards nearby townships or cities like Dhaka, the capital. Their decision to move was affected by how open or restricted that they perceived the border. For example, if there was an election in India, we were told that many border officers were taken off their posts and instead scheduled to provide security for local elections, which meant that created an opportunity for people to move across borders. Migration decisions were also affected by livelihood opportunities in the destination sites or familial obligations. While securitizing the border had curbed informal movement, which was historical and traditional in its own ways, our research found that trafficking was still very present. In fact, Benapole, or the land port that I keep referring to, accounts for half of all trafficking cases between Bangladesh and India. Our study respondents, while speaking about financial harm, spoke about cascading impacts of climate change. The rainfall that ruins a farmer's harvest is also the reason why hay for his cows is now 4 times more expensive. Small informal traders who were involved in cow trade in particular, that India has banned, had to stop their business and move to farming. And as climate change induced losses grew, their economic status changed drastically. We found that these small-time traders who work for wealthier and bigger players, the foot soldiers, as a key informant regarded them, were at the highest risk of death at these borders, while their bosses just simply continued on. In terms of communal discord, the biggest threat to social cohesion were disputes over assets like land, homes, livestock, but not religion. Rather, during our first field visit, an overwhelming majority reported that community building was really strong and neighbors were the first sort of point of contact when they needed support. However, after the political disruption of August 2024, while our Hindu respondents had said that no physical harm had come to them, they shared that there was a strong sense of fear for any certain uncertainties or violence that might happen. They felt that they were at the front lines of that damage. Moreover, in August, we also saw while Bangladesh and India were restricting mobility across borders and the mainstream masses welcomed these disruptions, traders on both sides and Bangladeshi day laborers in particular who were left without access to livelihoods on the other side of the border. And their stories were absent in this very security-driven discourse. Finally, we found that slow climate events generally did not sound alarm bells, such as in the midst of heat waves that will only worsen with global warming. There were no effective game plans on how to support people facing extreme heat. Protection from the impacts of erratic rainfall, too, was lacking. Bangladesh is very welcoming of NGO interventions since its independence in 1971. However, in borderlands, aid work simply didn't function the same way as it did elsewhere. The only form that does exist was in the form of microloans, no alternative livelihood programs, no other climate solutions, as again found elsewhere. We found that climate threats pave a way for greater disappointments in institutions as people's needs increase, their dependency too rises, causing rifts between community members and institutional actors. And while some were hopeful that the relationships would improve after government fell and the former prime minister fled, grievances like saltwater farming has yet to be addressed. Saltwater farming has increasingly salinized the landscape of the borderlands on top of climate change, leaving land barren, forcing people to buy food they once grew. And this industry is tied to local elites, driving saltwater aquaculture like that of tiger shrimps. We were able to identify intersectional subgroups of people at the risk of compounded fragility. We found that women, especially in salinity-affected areas, are at the risk of losing their reproductive organs as they work in saline water for long periods of time. The color of girls' skins being darkened by salinity puts them into early marriages because people think that it will be harder for them to get married once they get older. Community members who are elderly and those with disabilities find it difficult to secure themselves during emergencies, often resorting to staying back in flood-affected houses because shelters were not designed with them in mind and are often essentially just schools being repurposed as cyclone shelters. Approaching the end of my presentation, I wanted to share some key takeaways. The first is that border violence and whatever happens in peripheral borderlands is not just a local problem. Masses in Bangladesh and central mainstream planning is actively trying to address Indian hegemonic practices. And unless bilateral promises of shared care are met, violence will likely worsen. A constant state of insecurity in these borderlands cannot be normalized. Policymaking and advocacy must prioritize local voices. And also holistic stability in these spaces where there are competing planning interests require a new paradigm of working towards positive peace. And it must center the lives of those of the borderland residents instead of large-scale deals on infrastructure that have historically not amounted to much. Finally, I leave you with a quote that started my PhD journey, where I intend to bring planning and peace together. In Bangla, he said, "জলবায়ুর কারণে অনেক কিছু পরিবর্তন হয়েছে, আগের মতো শান্তি নেই," which roughly translates to climate change has disrupted many things. We no longer know the peace we once had. On that note, that is the report. If anyone wants to scan and read some more, thank you very much.
Very much, Tasnia. We'll come back on this with the audience after Dave's presentation. For a quick introduction, Dave Muthersky is the president and co-founder of Energy Peace Partners. Dave has worked in international conflict resolution and peace processes for more than 2 decades. His experience includes position within the International Crisis Group, Humanity United, and the African Union High-Level Panel on the Students. And building on this experience, he funded a program at the University of California, Berkeley, examining how climate change and energy solutions could contribute to peace-building objectives. This work ultimately led to the creation of Energy Peace Partners. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Clementine. Thank you, Tasnia. Nice to be here. My name is Dave Muthersky. And as mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called Energy Peace Partners. And part of what I'll be discussing today is an example of one of the approaches that we've developed to operationalize this intersection. UPP is staffed, it's built on the idea of using renewable energy as a tool for peace and a tool for peace building. It is based on the recognition that the least electrified countries in the world are often the most conflict affected and climate vulnerable. And on the one hand, there's amazing things happening in the renewable energy space globally. It's the leading global response to climate change. but very little climate finance, and in particular, renewable energy investment tends to go to fragile states. So as an organization, we bring together folks with peacebuilding, conflict resolution backgrounds, together with renewable energy development and renewable energy finance. We have 3 areas of work. The Peace Renewable Energy Credit, which I'll be speaking about today. This is a financing solution that we developed to support renewable energy projects. A research project called Powering Peace. We ran with the Simpson Center in Dartmouth, which has undertaken a number of in-depth country case studies, trying to unpack and understand the links between energy, conflict dynamics in a given conflict setting, and the opportunities in that context for using renewable energy to help mitigate some of the drivers of conflict or support peace. One of the hooks for those papers, we published reports on South Sudan, Somalia, Mali, DRC, and CAR, which have all hosted large UN or African Union peacekeeping missions. One of the entry points that we used was to try to argue why peacekeeping missions should shift from an overwhelming dependency on diesel to renewable energy as an entry point for peacebuilding. And then lastly, we developed a methodology, a framework for measuring the social and peace impacts of renewable energy projects in order to help build the evidence base and make the case, which I'll talk more about. So just looking at the map, as I said, the least electrified countries in the world tend to be the most conflict. And of the 600 plus million people in the world without electricity access, more than 60% live in fragile states. So there's very strong overlap, but very, very little global investment in renewable energy rather, goes to these fragile countries. It's not seen as a go-to approach for addressing fragility. It's not a priority from a climate lens often because many of these same countries are not large emission producing countries. So there's this gap in the framing of how people think about responding to fragility and then how we think about energy or renewable, we globally. So that's the problem that we're working on. And basically our hypothesis, our thesis is that renewable energy can serve as a win-win, especially around first-time electrification. It increases economic opportunities, it improves development outcomes, it can enhance and improve safety and security. It can mitigate some of the existing drivers of conflict in different places. So one of the things that we found is that in many conflict settings, often electricity access depends on diesel generators, and that diesel supply chains are are often controlled by conflict actors. So in South Sudan, we documented more than 24 checkpoints, armed checkpoints, between when refined petroleum crosses the border with Uganda outside of the capital to get anywhere in the country. It has to pass through more than 24 armed checkpoints. In Mali, there's a totally different supply chain, diesel supply chain in the north, controlled by armed actors. In Somalia, diesel is taxed by Al-Shabaab. So it looks different in different places, but it's a common through line. So the mechanism that we came up with, that we developed, is called a Peace Renewable Energy Credit. And basically, we adapted something that exists in developed energy markets called a renewable energy credit or renewable energy certificate. It's similar to it's a sister mechanism to a carbon credit, if folks are familiar with the carbon credit. Carbon credit represents a ton of CO2. It's a virtual climate mechanism. Renewable energy certificate represents a megawatt hour of clean energy generated. It's a virtual climate mechanism. And companies or governments use them for slightly different things. But a renewable energy certificate typically is used by a company to offset emissions specifically from its electricity, what's called scope 2 emissions. So it is a multi-billion-dollar market that probably you've never heard of, mostly in North America and Europe, where corporations are purchasing renewable energy certificates from renewable energy projects and using it to account for their total megawatt hours, their energy usage. So when you see on the next product that you buy, if the company says 100% renewable, there's a good chance that a good portion of that 100%, it doesn't mean that their factory is 100% solarized. It means that they're buying renewable energy certificates to get to that 100% energy usage. Why that's important is that it provides another revenue stream for renewable energy where the system exists. So a solar company or a solar project in Ontario, in Ottawa, can sell the electricity. They can also sell these virtual certificates, renewable energy certificates, to other buyers. So when we started looking at the countries that we were interested in, we realized this is a mechanism that could be adapted, could be extended. So we work under the main international standard body for renewable energy certificates. It's called the ITRAC standard, and they have developed something called an International Renewable Energy Certificate. When we first started this work, you'll notice on the map, many of the countries, most of the countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's where we were focusing. When we first started, there were only 3 countries in Africa that were connected to this international renewable energy certificate architecture. And so we have set ourselves up as under that international renewable energy certificate standard as a country issuer. And you can think of a Peace renewable energy credit as an impact label or a project from a fragile state, providing first-time electrification and other social benefits. So EPP's role was to adapt this mechanism, and we serve as the issuer. So we identify projects, we qualify projects, we issue the credits, and then transactions happen between the local project and the buyer, the corporate buyer. So there are 3 types of, and I'll go into some of the examples of specific projects, but in general, this can benefit 3 categories of actors. The first is the companies. So multinational companies typically are the buyers of renewable energy certificates, and in our case, Peace renewable energy credits. So Microsoft has made purchases, Google, Block, I'll talk more about some of those. But this is out of their overall sustainability portfolio and approach, this is a high impact, sometimes high visibility example that companies can use that advances other social impacts, other social goals. The middle category is project developers. So we work mostly with local renewable energy companies, and this offers another way for them to generate revenue from their projects and fund either new projects or additional social impact projects in their communities. And then the ultimate beneficiary are local communities who benefit from electrification or these knock-on social impact projects like hospital electrification or public streetlights or local agricultural productive use hubs. Sorry. So I'll go through a couple of examples. This was the very first PREC transaction. It was in Goma in Eastern Congo. The developer is a local Congolese company called Nuru, and the buyer was Microsoft. And Nuru at the time was building what was the largest solar mini grid in Africa. It's a 1.3 megawatt solar mini grid. And they had financing for the project itself, but they did not have the community, which had 3% electricity access prior to the project, asked for and wanted public streetlights. It was a very insecure area, and they didn't have funding for the streetlights. So when we first connected with Nuru and we're trying to identify and find a buyer for these PRECs, Microsoft expressed interest. They shared the request from the community for public streetlights, and that is what the first purchase funded. So it was an additional revenue stream to Nuru for the Peace renewable energy credits generated from this mini grid that funded public streetlights in the main intersection of this neighborhood of Ndosho. And the impacts of that were significant. It improved security. It led to night markets, and businesses being able to stay open later. And we conducted a data collection both in Ndosho and the neighboring community, which did not yet have electrification or streetlights, and found that the overall level of positive peace, of peacefulness in Ndosho was 9% higher than the neighboring community. A second example was in South Sudan, Malakal. So South Sudan is the least electrified country in the world. There's essentially some electricity access in the capital, in Juba, and almost no electricity access outside of Juba. It's an oil-producing country, but it doesn't have any domestic refining capacity, so everything needs to be re-imported. So the solar plant, in this case, the solar project, was in an IDP camp in a town called Malakal that was run by IOM, International Organization for Migration. They had built this because they were spending over $1 million a year flying diesel in to power services in the camp. And we worked with IOM on 3 purchases from this system. The first 2 were purchased by a company called Block, which funded local hospital electrification, solarization in Malakal and in Bor. The third purchase was actually by Blackpink, which is a big K-pop band, if anyone knows Blackpink. It was the management company of Blackpink purchased these because the band is interested in youth engagement. So the revenue from the purchase funded the solarization and electrification of a local university in South Sudan, which is very cool. And Blackpink and IOM set up a booth at their concerts in Seoul and Paris to talk about this. So unusual, but great. Third example was Ethiopia in Shedder. This is a refugee camp near the border with Somalia in the Somali region. It was developed by Mercy Corps, and Mercy Corps created a spin-off called Humanitarian Energy that is providing mini grids in humanitarian settings. And the buyer was Apple. And Apple actually entered into a 10-year purchase. It's also funding streetlights both in the refugee camp and in the host community. And so this was, up until this point, the longest term purchase that we've had. But it's exciting. It was breaking new ground, and it gives us hope for what is to come. So up to now, well, this is as of the end of 2025, there have been a little over $1.6 million of total direct transactions from corporate buyers to local renewable energy projects in 7 countries. There have been 10 companies that have purchased, and more than 18 communities have benefited, and more than 250,000 people in those communities. So we are scaling this. I'm just going to jump ahead, and then I'll come back to this. So the question is, what does this actually mean? Like, how does this link to peace building? Is it just electrification? So we've seen, I think, enough projects and enough ideas that we're starting to see models or clusters of what this can look like and how it can work. So I've listed 5 categories. The first is projects that mitigate this war economy, this control of diesel supply chains, dependency on diesel. In some cases, it's charcoal. Introducing clean energy reduces the need for that, and in some cases creates other economic opportunities. The second is community dispute resolution. So there are 2 examples we know of where you had local community conflict, disagreement over borders, disagreement between tribes in the case of the project in northern Nigeria. And it was the opportunity or the prospect of a renewable energy company and a renewable energy project coming in that facilitated or encouraged the communities actually to come together and reach some kind of agreement. The third is job creation and economic development. So this is something that in some cases, I guess, happens organically around first-time electrification. But one of our partners in Eastern DRC, Virunga Energies, this is their whole thesis behind these hydroelectric projects that they're building in DRC. And in addition to first-time electrification, they've created these economic development zones and supported the standing up of local companies, to create what they call green jobs. And so they've set up a soap factory, a cocoa company, cocoa processing facility, and they have documented that for every megawatt of energy that they brought online, it's created between 900 to 1,000 new jobs, and 11% has gone to former armed combatants. So that's the one example actually that has an explicit peace and conflict thesis built into their energy strategy. Public streetlights, as I've mentioned, there have been a handful of very impactful projects we've worked on where the PREX have funded all the streetlights, and there have been very clear local security improvements in those cases, in some cases, economic improvements as well. And the last category is peace dividends. And this is more, I think, hypothetical than proven so far. One can imagine the use of renewable energy as a way to, as something that could be incorporated into peace agreements, as something that could be used to solidify peace agreements. We've only found a single peace agreement so far that includes renewables. That was the 2015 Algiers Agreement for Mali. Interestingly, the context is that the conflict in Mali, in part, is like a center-periphery conflict with underdevelopment and grievances around historic underdevelopment in the north, which is part of what fuels the cycles of conflict. If you can look at a lot of different indicators that will bear that out, including energy access. So if you look at electrification in the country, it's very low in the north and much stronger in the south. And so the peace agreement acknowledged that. And one of the areas of emphasis was solar investment in the north. It wasn't implemented, but that's the one example that there's a couple other conflicts we've researched that also have that center periphery dynamic where uneven electricity access and investment follows that same pattern. Central African Republic is the most recent report we published that also shows that. 2 months ago, in March, we co-organized a workshop with the Stanley Center for Peace and Security, Simpson Center, and Dartmouth on this theme. And it was, similar to what Hasnia said about a lot of the actors being siloed. We've found the same thing, that global energy developers are not talking with peace-building organizations. The funders or investors are not interested in hearing about conflict, even though there's that figure at the start that 60% of electricity are in tribal states. Conflict is seen as a scary word and something to be downplayed. And so we had a workshop with renewable energy developers from DRC, South Sudan, and Nigeria, government officials, investors and funders, multilaterals, peace-building organizations, to try to break some of this down. And there was recognition that conflict was a reality, that it wasn't something that in many of the places where folks were working, and ultimately it would only be beneficial to call it out and recognize it and try to incorporate solutions into project development rather than just sweeping it under the carpet. And with that there were actually tremendous, significant new opportunities that we can use if we think about renewable energy as something that can help support peace. It's a framing that is very complementary to the energy access community, a climate community, the peace building community, but it's not a framing that is really well recognized. So there were some exciting ideas that came out of that. And there's some work underway coming out of that on the research front, on finance, and on policy. So just to go back, so what we're doing next with the PREC aggregation, with the PREC, is we're launching a larger financing facility called the aggregation facility. And very briefly, the problem that is aiming to solve is all of the examples that I shared. Buyers were buying PRECs from projects that already existed. So typically the way that REC markets work, we learned, is a company will, in January 2026, they'll say, how much energy do we use in 2020? 1,000 megawatt hours. Okay, we need to buy 1,000 RECs from 2025. So it means that they're only buying from projects that already exist. So if our goal is to use the PREC to help finance new projects in practical settings, we need to come up with a new solution. And that's what the aggregation facility is. It will be an $11.3 million facility funded by the Development Bank Nordic Development Fund. And it will be able to pre-purchase 10 years of PRECs from projects that are not yet financed. And the goal is to provide those projects with up to 10% of construction costs. It's not debt, it's not equity. They can monetize the PREC upfront, and the hope is that makes it easier to raise the rest of the financing. So that aggregation facility, which we hope will launch the second half of this year, is expected to provide first-time electrification to more than 850,000 people, as well as a number of other across 14 fragile countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The last point I'll make on this is I mentioned at the beginning the peace impact methodology that we developed. So this is a monitoring and evaluation framework we've developed to be able to measure the social and peace impacts of renewable energy projects. And so we will be undertaking these data collections ahead of and then over the course of project implementation for all 30 to 35 projects, first-time electrification projects that are being supported by the aggregation facility. And so hopefully what that means is that we are going to have a body of evidence, a pretty unique body of evidence over the next couple of years that documents the impact of first-time electrification in fragile states across 30 plus settings. And that's something that doesn't exist currently in the renewable energy space in general. So a lot of what we're doing now is really still built on a hypothesis, and there's some anecdotal evidence and there's momentum, but hopefully in a couple of years we have a much stronger body of evidence for the impacts. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much to you both for these presentations. So although you did address different approaches and geographies, each of you demonstrated that climate vulnerability is fundamentally shaped by governance arrangements, social inclusions, and access to resources. So before opening the floor to everyone, I'd like to begin with the first questions. So Dave, you have noted that many renewable energy projects are implemented in conflict-affected settings, yet developers and investors are often reluctant to explicitly discuss conflicts. And similarly, Tasnia, you observed that institutional behavior changes dramatically once an organization recognizes the presence of military actors or political violence. So does those raise the broader question to me? Why, according to you, institutions remain hesitant to openly acknowledge conflict and insecurity when designing climate intervention, despite the fact that conflict is explicitly recognized, as you mentioned, Dave, when presenting the workshop? And what would be the consequences of treating conflict as an external issue rather than for design consideration?
There's good reason for investors to be wary of investing in conflict settings, right? You have increased security risks, you have increased political risks, and they're trickier. So I'm not suggesting that it's all made up. But you have institutional practices, let's say, that separate out crisis funding and humanitarian aid, which is often the international funding, at least, that is going into tribal settings, from development funding. And renewable energy is typically not included as a mainstream in humanitarian funding or crisis funding. And then so like that's kind of from the international aid, international funding side. From the government side, what we've seen is that governments are responsible for electrification. In some fragile settings, the government may not have the capacity, but also with a few exceptions, you don't have the same actors within government thinking about electrification that are also mandated to deal with peace and conflict issues. And so one of the light bulb moments at this workshop that I mentioned was we had someone from Nigeria's Rural Electrification Agency, which is the body tasked with electrification outside of the main grid. So all solar mini grids in Nigeria basically run through or operate under this umbrella. And he was a little skeptical on the first day. like, what are we talking about? And all this peace stuff. But he came along over the course of the workshop. And on the last day, he said, listen, I'll be honest, we have a ton of information in our office. We have categories, we've mapped out every agriculturally viable community, every health facility. We have these categories that we use to prioritize projects. We don't have a category for fragility. It isn't a lens that we use, even though when you look at conflict in the country and electrification, like we see that projects are not going into the far north, but we don't recognize that. We don't have anything. So I think some of it is just breaking down barriers and initiating and supporting these conversations. The last thing I'll say on that, is I think the solution on the investment and money side is some kind of, I mean, in the workshop, we called it a peace premium. It's not to expect that these are all need to be grant funded projects or that they all need to be private sector, 100% private sector funded projects. But there needs to be something that mitigates some of the risk and incentivizes developers and projects to go into places where, from a purely economic perspective, it's not going to be at the top of their list. So some kind of additional subsidy, and there's examples of this. I mean, the PREC is one, but there are some examples, but more work needs to be done to create this peace premium methodology and mechanism.
Just to add to that, I think a question about why institutions hesitate to acknowledge conflict depends also on the space that the institutions are concerned with. So at a border, what happens when you acknowledge conflict is there is a securitization response. So a couple of papers that I was reading while we were doing the research had examples of the US military doing a simulation of what happens when the Bengal Delta is flooded and there are millions of Bangladeshis, now looking for homes. And what would the US military do in that situation? It seems wild, but these are also questions that, the military regime across the globe are asking themselves. And so when you talk about conflict, there is we have to acknowledge the hard truth that for us to come to conversations about human security, we need to, jump a lot of barriers, direct people left and right, and hope that they arrive at that conclusion. But the easiest conclusion is to come at, nation state security. What does it mean for the country? And that automatically deprioritizes a lot of people who have historically been, vulnerable to violence and different forms of violence, and whether it be slow violence, whether it be violence by a military regime trying to safeguard their borders. And so in terms of, also what Dave has mentioned, the fact that when you assign fragility, that banner to a space, the immediate impacts are borders are closed or visas are banned. For example, the disruption that I spoke about when the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh fled, I think in the next couple of months, what I saw was embassies closed down. Students who had, their master's starting or degree starting, they couldn't find, go out of the country anymore. And they were treated as a threat, even by countries with good bilateral ties, because that's how nation states function. I think the last point that I would sort of end at is that we have a long way to go in terms of reframing peace. I think we tend to, when we think about biopolitics and how peace is framed, and we create these indicators, and at the end of these indicators, we separate the globe with, red, orange, and green. Some places are peaceful and others are not. It's a useful tool. It has many purposes, but there also needs to be a space where we discuss about peace as lived, as embodied by these residents, because even in spaces where you would think that, this is a conflict-free zone, You just need to speak to people in terms of how violence really shapes their everyday. And that's something that we see in, for example, shrimp aquaculture, where in Bangladesh, a huge chunk of the GDP is funded by shrimp aquaculture. But like I said, women spend hours in a day in saline waters trying to separate fish, and they have rashes on their bodies. Their uterus is being, taken out of their body. It's incredibly violent, but it falls short to the GDP conversation. And so I think we have a long way to go about how we talk about peace.